Good evening. I'm Aja Holmes. I'm a PhD student in the Educational Leadership Policy Studies Department, the coordinator of Black History Month Planning Committee, and also a member on the Committee of Lectures. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker of the evening, Robert V. Morris. Robert V. Morris is the author of the New Illustrated History, Black Faces of War, a legacy of honor from the American Revolution to today. The grandson and son of two decorated Army officers, Morris founded the Fort Des Moines Memorial Park and the World War II Iowa Tuskegee Airmen Memorial at the Des Moines Airport. His documentary, Tradition and Valor, was broadcast on Iowa Public Television and preceded the release of his book by the same name. Morris is a graduate of the University of Iowa. We won't hold it against him. And has also taught journalism at Iowa State University and is the past president of the NAACP Iowa-Nebraska Conference. The same documentary will also air tomorrow night on Iowa's public TV at 9 p.m. Before we begin, we want to remind you guys that we'll also have a book signing and a reception at the end. So please give a warm welcome to Robert V. Morris.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Is this thing? Yeah, it is. Okay. Okay. Anyway, I'm Robert Morris, native of Des Moines. This book that I hope everyone will take a look at, whether you buy one or not while you're here, is a real labor of love for me because I am the grandson and son of two very important Army officers who are both decorated combat veterans and both broke the glass ceiling of segregation in their respective eras. The book features, it's a big 11 by 9.5 inch illustrated book, and it features over 260 photographs, many of which are original, a lot of them out of our family collection. And but the strongest point of the book is the personal stories that are told on its pages, the personal accounts. None of them have been published before this, and that's what really makes the book really special. So I hope that everyone will take the time to look through the book and read the various chapters. 8 chapters in the book. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to go through and talk about the various features in the book and some of the stories and kind of let you know how they came about and some interesting facts that you might not be aware of. Number one, the book starts with the Revolutionary War. You know, in the Revolutionary War, which is chapter 1, 75% of the African Americans who fought in the Revolutionary War fought on the side of the British. Over 100,000 blacks, in return for their service to either the United or the Continental Army or the British, received their freedom in return. 15,000 African Americans fought directly in the British military, most of them in the British Royal Navy. And so, there was a lot of participation. Both sides, it's kind of like you hear the old story of they need you but they don't want you. Well, in the Revolutionary War, both sides knew that in order to win, they needed African Americans to fight on their side, but neither side really wanted them. And when British Lord Dunsmore published a proclamation saying that he would grant freedom to any slave who fought for the British, then George Washington immediately countered with his own measures to try to get African Americans into the American Army. Some of the names that ring out, that we mentioned in the book: Crispus Attucks, the Boston Massacre, which is where he was the first American to die in the Revolutionary War. Peter Salem and Salem Poor, two war heroes that were granted their freedom directly by the Continental Congress. And so we had a number of heroes in the Revolutionary War. Unfortunately, none of those guys are still around, so getting personal accounts from them is pretty hard. But if we move up through time we get a little closer to some, chances to do that. We go from there, Revolutionary War, into the industry of slavery. Slavery was based on cash crops, okay, tobacco, rice, cotton, obviously, sugar cane, which was very, 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 very brutal to do. But sugar cane fields are flooded with water, and the water was full of bacteria and poisonous snakes. And so if a slave that had to hack sugar cane with a machete, if they got a nick or a cut anywhere below the knee, they'd have gangrene within a matter of hours, and it wasn't a pleasant occupation. Most of your sugar cane was done in Louisiana and around in the swamp areas where they could hold water because it needs water under it. That's why it's such the sugar factory sugar industry is very important, but it's very dangerous when people have to do it by hand. And the African slaves who had to prove their endurance in the heat and the sun were the choice to harvest those crops. The other cash crops, you're well aware, tobacco was big, and even there was some tea was grown, which was a big industry, obviously, for the British. Well, anyway, slavery, in the book, there's a number of actions that were kind of things that, made things a little easier. Slave lore, some of the writings by slaves making fun of their masters, and some of the songs like Wade in the Water, which were written as escape, songs. Wade in the Water is wading in the water to escape, okay? And there are a number of others, Negro spirituals, that were written in that respect as well. And two particularly fascinating characters that are listed in the book that you'll see. One is Harriet Tubman. A lot of people have heard of Harriet Tubman, who operated the Underground Railroad, and she led over 70 slaves to freedom on a number of journeys to the South. And she carried a pistol, and if slaves would get scared or want to turn back, she would tell them, if you try to turn back, I'm going to shoot you. So you had to go, once you went out with them, you had to go all the way or she was going to shoot you. She wasn't going to let you turn back because then you're going to tell what was going on and the whole thing would blow up. Well, on top of that, Harriet Tubman, a lot of people don't know, is that she was also a combatant. And she led the first Union Army raid ever led by a woman on the Combahee River in South Carolina and freed 700 slaves in 1864. And so she had a very dual role. She had been, as a young girl, had been hit in the head by a metal object that was thrown by another slave. And because of that head injury, she suffered these great delusions that she thought were divine, and those guided the activities that she did, including the Underground Railroad. Another character in the book that is very interesting is Henry Box Brown. They call him Box because this is a guy who mailed himself to freedom from Richmond to Philadelphia in a 2-by-3-foot wood crate. And his story in there describing his 27-hour journey is just absolutely fascinating. And there's even a picture that he used. He went on tour after the Civil War and went to Europe and everything, and told his story. And that's probably as fascinating a story as you're ever going to hear, how somebody could mail themselves to freedom. He was a slave who had married and had 3 children, and then his slave owner sold his wife and his 3 children to another slave master who took him down south. And he was very despondent from his inability to stop that, and that's the reason why he decided to mail himself out of Richmond and on to Philadelphia. It's a fascinating story. And the way that he describes it is just so well written. It's just very interesting. Well, after slavery, obviously, you come to the Civil War. The Civil War chapter was written by my brother, who's an attorney in Des Moines, who's an expert on the Civil War and the post-Civil War era of Western expansion. We had a couple 100,000 blacks who served in the Civil War. Some of the more notable. Has anybody here seen the movie Glory? Okay, that's a movie that was made about the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, and That group was personally recruited by black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was one of the key leaders, and all that is in the book. We get into the expansion of the western frontier. After the Civil War, there were 4 black regiments that were formed for service. The first 2 were the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments, and they served on the plains. And the second 2, who have gotten a lot more notoriety, were the 9th and 10th Cavalry, who were called the Buffalo Soldiers, and also served on the plains and in the Southwest, and in the Indian Wars, and also fought Mexican bandits and all kinds of folks. But the biggest thing they fought off was boredom and disease, and it wasn't as glamorous as a movie might make it look. And there's been a couple movies about the Buffalo Soldiers who were called Buffalo Soldiers. There's a number of explanations for that, and who knows which one is right. Personally, and I was a filmmaker for the federal government for 15 years, and the most fascinating film that I made was on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota with the Lakota Indians, which are called Apaches. And actually, Apache was a name that was given them by the Pawnees and means cutthroat, which they actually didn't like. So they didn't like being called, not Apache, the Sioux Indians, I'm saying. The Sioux means, in Pawnee, Sioux means cutthroat. And the Lakotas did not like that name, but it's kind of like, got a life of its own in American history. But anyway, while we were shooting that film on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the late 80s, on the next reservation over, which was the Rosebud Reservation, that's where they were filming Dances with Wolves at that time with Kevin Costner. And we ran into some of their crew around, because you stay in the border towns around the reservations. It's a very drastic situation out there, because you have 3 groups there. You have the full-bloods, the breeds, and the whites, and they all hate each other's guts, and they don't cooperate with each other. And if anyone's ever seen that, what's the movie, about the Indian reservation out there? Well, anyway, but there's been a number of movies made about that and about the struggle of the American Indian movement and the various influences on the reservation. And it's not a very pretty place. Sugar diabetes, unemployment, suicide, and all those horrible maladies are just terrible out there. And it remains so to this day, even though some of the Indian tribes have gotten casinos now and everything. But the role of the black troops out there, and then in the Southwest, where they went up against the Apaches and also Mexican bandits and everything, is pretty interesting. And there's a lot of that in there. That chapter, again, was written by Attorney William Morris, who's a University of Iowa grad, I must say. But anyway, then from there, it goes into where I really start getting some really great personal accounts. And there's a couple in the Civil War chapter, but there's a couple that to me are just like fabulous. The World War I chapter, and by the way, before I get off the post-Civil War, the Western expansion, the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers also fought in the Spanish-American War and saved Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders in that war, and that's another story that's in there. But once you get up into the World War I era, then you kind of start getting into, my family's history. There were 2 World War I veterans who made a very distinct impact on this book. And the reason that they made such a distinct impact is there was a lady named Elaine Estes, who was a black lady who was a longtime director of the Des Moines Public Library. And in 1975, she had the foresight to sit those 2 guys down and make a audio recording of their story, all the way from where they came from to becoming officers in the first black officer class open to African Americans at Fort Des Moines in 1917, to France, where they fought with the 92nd Division, and then back home again during the Blood Red summer of 1919. They called it Blood Red because there was so much racial violence for the returning soldiers from World War I. Well, anyhow, these 2 guys, one of them was my grandfather. His name was James B. Morris. He was a graduate of Howard Law School in 1915, and actually my daughter and my daughter, who's sitting over there, went to Howard exactly 90 years after he left Howard Law School to come out here and enlist in the in the first black officer class. And this is my son and my daughter over here, my son Brandon and Jessica, my daughter who just graduated Howard University. Brandon plans to come up here and join you guys sometime soon. So he's going to break our University of Iowa tradition and be a cyclone. So, but that's cool because he likes outdoors and he's interested in animal ecology. So anyway, and my other son, by the way, is, while we're on World War I, my other son is serving in the Air Force in the Great Britain right now at RAF Lakenheath, which is, there's 3 big American air bases there, and they're all on former or current RAF bases. The British and the Americans are there together. And the thing that's really ironic about it is that he's defending a country that would not allow his great-grandfather to land there. When the 92nd Division went to France in 1918, Great Britain refused permission to have them land because they did not want black soldiers and black officers to set foot on their soil. And they were sent on to France, where they did their additional training before they entered the war. The thing that's ironic about that is that the British and the French were losing the war to the Germans. Had the Americans not intervened, they'd all be speaking German right now. And that actually happened twice, but I'll talk about the second time. Well, so anyway, in World War I, like I said, my grandfather, he talked about, Fort Des Moines, which was a 90-day training for black commissioned officers. First time. There had been 3 blacks who had graduated West Point before that, but this was the first time that there was a class of commissioned officers that were trained. And they did a 90-day camp in the summer of 1917 and got their commissions. He talks about what went on there, and it's pretty interesting. There was one fellow from New Jersey who, for some reason, you can imagine they called him the Tree Man. And why they called him the Tree Man, I don't know. But anyway, when Mrs. Estes asked him, well, was there any trouble at the camp? He said, well, the only trouble they had was this guy named the Tree Man. And he said, and 2 company commanders were standing together, and one of them asked the other one, well, how's your Tree Man doing? And they didn't realize he was standing right behind them. And so he was pretty pissed off about it, and they had a big fight. And that was the talk of the camp for weeks, about the Tree Man. But anyway, the most fascinating story of all, for me in the book, is a story of Lieutenant James Mitchell. Mitchell was a longtime friend of my grandfather's, and he fought he was at Fort Des Moines, although they didn't know each other there. And he fought in the 350th Heavy Machine Gun Battalion. Okay, they were an overhead fire battalion. If anybody knows anything about the military, as a matter of fact, Governor Harold Hughes, late governor, he was in a heavy machine gun battalion, provided overhead fire in World War II. But anyway, Mitchell was a native of Georgia, was a graduate of Morris Brown College, and his father was a circuit preacher in Georgia. And back in those days, you had a lot of little churches who couldn't afford to have a minister, so they used circuit preachers who would come through and give a sermon, and then they would pay them with, meals or chickens or anything that they had that they could compensate them with. And so, like, he grew up in Georgia trapping quail and picking up old snake skins in the creek, which he would sell for 10 cents a dozen to the townspeople. For some reason, they wanted old snake skins. But he had heard a speech down in Atlanta about that American officer, a white officer, was giving a speech and said, after this war, when we beat the Huns, which is what they called the Germans at that time, that there won't be any brown Americans, any white Americans, or any black Americans. We'll all just be Americans. So the speech had a big impact on him. So he went and enlisted and ended up at Fort Des Moines, did his officer training in the 92nd Division, went overseas in May of 1918, and he was in some really heavy combat over there. He was at Belleau Wood. Has anybody ever heard of Belleau Wood? I know there's like a Belleau Wood company around here, but what that is that's a French city where the Marines fought what they consider to be one of their 4 greatest and bloodiest battles, okay, at Belleau Wood against the Germans. And a lot of people don't know that the left flank for the Marines was covered by black heavy machine gun units from the 92nd Division in that battle. And also, he went through some really heavy combat in the Argonne Forest, which is, there was a movie called, I think, The Lost Boys, about that a few years back, about the horrible combat that took place in the Argonne Forest, which is in eastern France, and then he was in the final battle at Metz. And one of the things that he talked about is the wonderful reception the black troops got from the French people, who were very, very nice. Took them, he said, when they'd go into a town, that, you know, the mayor would take him into his home and let him stay at his home, and the French people were just wonderful. And the southern white Americans really despised that and sent out notes telling the French people that we really resent how you're treating these Negroes like equals. And a big list of all these horrible things, that they had tails and everything. And so that's quite a story. Well, so he went on and went through all this heavy combat. And the best part of his story, though, is when he came home from the war, and he wanted to go down south and surprise his father, who was a circuit preacher in Georgia. And obviously that was very dangerous at that time. And so he came home and got to Atlanta and went to his dad's church. And the other minister told him, well, your dad has gone down to this city named Barnesville, which is about 50 miles south of Atlanta, and he's preaching down there. And why don't you just wait for him and he'll be back? He said, no, I want to surprise him. And so he was wearing his uniform with medals on his chest and his pistol in his pocket because he knew there could be some trouble. So he gets on the train, goes down to Barnesville. He gets to this little church where his dad's supposed to be, and he goes in there, and the local pastor, he says, well, he was here and spoke at the morning services this morning, but he's gone back to Atlanta already. And so he's like, dang, I missed him. So he's getting ready to go back, and the preacher says, well, you know, we've never seen a black officer before. Would you stay and talk to my congregation this afternoon and tell them about your experiences and what went on in France? And we'd really like to hear it. And he said, well, no, I'm not a speaker. I'm just a dumb soldier. I'm going to go back. And the preacher just begged him. So finally he said, okay, you know, I'll stay and I'll talk to him and tell him what happened in France. Well, so he speaks at the afternoon services, and all the people, the congregation comes in, and they sit there, and they're just fascinated by what he's saying. But the very last thing he says in the speech was, he says, well, you know, he said, I've traveled my army, you know, with the Army in my travels, I've traveled 25,000 miles, you know, and he said, I've fought alongside men of every color and, you know, from every place in the world. And he says, you know, but the most dastardly creature on the earth is a Southern cracker, okay? And when he says that, the minister gets up and runs out of the church, and all the people, you know, rather than saying amen or something, they start moaning and groaning. And he asked the bishop, he said, what in the heck is wrong with these people? And so he says, son, why don't you come outside and let's talk? So they go outside, and the congregation's just flown out of the church, right? And they go outside, and he says, now, son, he says, I know what you said up there was the truth, and we really appreciate it. He said, but a bunch of these Negroes are going to tell the white folks what you said about them, and they'll do something about it. So you better get out of town right now. So Mitchell says, you know, I've been through all this combat and blood and guts. He said, I'm not scared of these cowards. He said, my train comes at 5 o'clock, and I'll be on the train at 5 o'clock. So the preacher takes him down, drops him off a block away from the train station. So he walks, because he doesn't want to be seen dropping him off. So he walks to the train station. So he's standing on the platform with his medals on his chest, his pistol in his pocket. And the white folks are milling around looking at him, looking him over, but nobody says anything, doesn't try. And he's just standing there like, well, come on, if you're going to do something, bring it. You know, I'm ready, you know. So they walk back and forth. Nobody does anything. Train comes at 5 o'clock, gets on the train, goes back to Atlanta. So anyway, a week later, he gets a letter from this preacher down there. And the preacher says that night, a white mob came through the black community and tore every house to pieces looking for him. They were going to lynch him. Isn't that something? They're going to lynch him for one thing. And these Negroes in the church ran and told the white folks the story. So anyway, that's some crazy stuff that's in there. But his story is just, you read that story, it's just fascinating. When we get to World War II, there's a lot of very interesting personal accounts in there. One of them is by a guy named Luther Smith. Luther Smith was a Tuskegee Airman. He's from Des Moines, or was from. He died about a year ago, just about a year ago. And he became a Tuskegee Airman. He was in the first class of 43E and went over there and flew 133 combat missions successfully without a scratch. And, back then, you usually, a fighter pilot only flew 50 missions, so he flew almost 3 times as many missions as he was supposed to. And he's on his way back to his last mission before he's going to be transferred home. And they're flying back, and they happen to look down, and there's a railroad yard down there. And he notices that there's some German munition trains. They're carrying ammunition that are crossing through this rail yard, so they decide they're going to attack. So they go down there and strafe these trains. And when he goes down and he strafes this train, the train blows up, and a big fireball. And he's going so fast he can't avoid it, so he's got to fly through the fireball. And so when he does that, his plane catches on fire. So he's trying to gain altitude. And in those days, there wasn't any ejection seat on an airplane. You had to roll it over and drop out. That's the only way that you got out of it. So anyway, he gets as high as he can, and he realizes that the plane's going to blow up. So he rolls it over and tries to jump out. And when he jumps out, his foot gets caught. And the impact of him jumping out of that plane and the plane torquing busts his pelvis in half and turns his leg backwards. Okay, and he's in so much terror that he passes out. Wakes up, he's in a head-first fall. He can see his tattered parachute dragging behind him, and he can look down, he can see where his plane's already passed him and gone down and crashed in a big fireball. So he falls all this way, and he lands in a tree, which just literally breaks what he's not already hurt. It just breaks every bone in his body almost, okay? So the Germans come up, and they're going to rob him. And he's a graduate of East High in Des Moines, and he's got on his class ring. And they want that ring, so they're getting ready to cut his finger off to get that ring. And but a German officer comes up, and realizing that an officer and an airman is a good trade because they know they're going to lose the war, so they're trying to get as many prisoners as they can so they can trade them to try to get some concessions and get to the west and get away from the Russians who are coming. But anyway, he comes up and he stops and pulls his gun and stops these guys from chopping his finger off. And so they pull him out of the tree, throw him over a horse, and take him to the hospital. So the next 7 months, he's in this hospital in a full-body cast, okay? And back then, which was a common practice, even in the Civil War, they put maggots in there to eat the dead tissue. So you've got a full-body cast, and you have all these maggots that are inside it, and you can feel them plucking that dead tissue off you. Well, anyway... So he spends his nights suffering, and then his days playing cards with the wounded Nazi officers who are in the hospital too. So and teaches himself German. Well, this guy, the Germans didn't set his pelvis right in his leg, and so it ended up one leg was 6 inches shorter than the other for the rest of his life. Okay, and they never could really fix it. So anyhow, when he's finally rescued, he comes back and has to go through a bunch more, rehabilitation and surgeries and everything. But this guy comes back, goes back to the University of Iowa. He had already got his undergrad there, gets his graduate degree in engineering, and then he goes and finally gets a job with General Electric, the first black who had ever been hired by General Electric. And then through that, he became the first black American engineer in the NASA space program. Okay, so this guy gone through all this, and he still has got the oomph to go and achieve something with his life. And he was, fortunately, before he died, he received a lot of honors. He was one of 7 veterans selected by President Clinton to go to Europe with him to celebrate the 50th anniversary of World War II. And he was also, before he died, and I went up there for that, he was honored as a distinguished alumni by University of Iowa and by the University of Iowa College of Engineering. So he really got a lot of accolades. And, of course, I created the Tuskegee Airmen Memorial to honor our 12 Iowa Flyers. If anybody's ever in Des Moines at the airport, and go over on the north side, and at the Air Guard entrance, you'll see they've got two jets that they flew, and then they've got our big P-51 out there on a post. And it's very impressive, very impressive. Now, one of the other stories in World War II that I really like is a guy named Virgil Dixon. This guy was actually my godfather. I told you I grew up around a lot of war veterans and combat veterans. And the reason that, people ask me, well, how do you know all these people and how did they all know each other? Well, in those days, there weren't many black professionals nationally. So the ones that there were tended to know each other. So they all knew each other. Okay, it's not like now where people are all over the place. Back then it was segregated. Black people lived in the same areas. Even the highly educated ones lived in the same areas. And so they tended to know each other. But anyway, matter of fact, George Washington Carver, the home I grew up in on Hickman Road in Des Moines, my next door neighbor, which is now the late judge and Willie Glanton, but before that, it was Archie Alexander, was a famous engineer and graduate, and he would have fundraising parties, and one of his guests that he would have over there was George Washington Carver. And these guys all knew each other. The highly educated blacks knew each other. The thing that always, makes you wonder is how did these guys get around so well with segregation and everything, but they did. But anyway, Virgil Dixon, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I guess it was, President Bush gave the Tuskegee Airmen a unit citation of a gold medal. And I was very unhappy with that because I'm a great supporter of the Tuskegee Airmen as my monument that I helped create shows. But, half of those guys didn't go overseas, and they lost, they had like 60 guys killed in World War II. There were 900 of them, and like 450 of them went overseas, and the rest of them didn't. Well, these guys got a medal even though they didn't go overseas. Now, my Virgil Dixon was in the 758 tankers, which were attached to the 92nd Division in Italy, which was the bloodiest combat the black Americans were in as a group in World War II. Okay, the Italian campaign was a rear guard action by the Germans, the great General Kesselring, and they had 88 millimeter guns on the high ground, firing down on these tanks. And the 92nd Division lost 5,000 casualties in the Italian campaign. Now, death did usually include about 10% of your casualties, and that's dead and wounded. Okay, so if they lost 5,000, you can at least 500 of them killed, and then another 4,500 that were wounded. Well, none of them ever got a medal. Okay, and so that's one problem I have with that. But it was a very bloody campaign. It ended in a stalemate, and the Germans didn't surrender till the war ended in Italy. Okay, but so his story is in there. And then another related story was actually my mother. Okay, now has anybody ever seen the movie The Tuskegee Airmen with Lawrence Fishburne? Seen that? Okay, well, that movie was written by and about a guy from Ottumwa, Iowa. His name was Robert Williams. He was a lieutenant, was a Tuskegee Airman, flew 50 combat missions. Well, he was my mother's boyfriend during the war, and his plane was named the Duchess Arlene after her. And that's one side of the plane. The monument in Des Moines is named after her. Well, not only did she have a plane named after her, but she had the opportunity to type the final plans for the atomic bomb. Okay, now a lot of people that don't know the truth about the atomic bomb run around saying stuff like, oh, it was a terrorist act and they wouldn't have done it to the Germans and blah, blah, blah. The reason that the atomic bomb was dropped, okay, was that Army intelligence had predicted 1 million Allied casualties from a mainland invasion of Japan in World War II, okay? 1 million. A lot of us, including myself and my kids here, wouldn't even be here probably had that happened because my father, I'm going to talk about next, his 6th Army had been selected. They're called the Alamo Force, and they're also called MacArthur's Navy because they were his elite landing force. They had already been selected to be the first Army unit to land on Japan, and being a forward scout in that, his chances of getting killed were real good. And had that happened, none of us would have ever existed, and you wouldn't have my book here either. So, there's a lot of things. I mean, if you think about 1 million Allied casualties, a whole bunch of Americans would have never existed, and much less, Australians and the other allies and Britons. But so anyhow, of the two lead scientists that led the atomic bomb, one of them was black. His name was Ernest Wilkins. He was what Ebony Magazine later called the Negro genius. He was a guy that had gotten his BA at University of Chicago at 15, his MA at 17, and his PhD at 19. So he was a very brilliant individual. And so anyhow, that was done. Well, she had not met my father at that time, okay? And they wouldn't meet for another year after the war on the University of Iowa campus in 1946. But so indirectly, she had a hand in maybe saving his life by helping to create the atomic bomb. A lot of people who died in Japan, but there would have been a hell of a lot more Allied troops that would have died in a mainland invasion, which was prevented by the dropping of the atomic bomb. Now, when it comes to another story in there is my father's story. My father was a captain in the 6th Army Alamo Force, which is a predecessor of today's Special Forces. And he broke the color line in the 6th Army. He was segregated, but his service was pretty exceptional. And we were able to find his you'll see the documentary the other night, tomorrow night, it was made in 1994. We were able to find his combat records, so I was able to do a chronology to find out exactly how he went along. And he graduated University of Iowa with his undergrad in 1941, and then he went to basic training at Camp Leonard Wood, or Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and did so well he was promoted to sergeant and was sent to Army Intelligence, which is G2, in Washington, D.C., after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Did very well there, was sent to military intelligence in Sydney, Australia, South Pacific headquarters, and did very well there. Well, he was even sent back home undercover on an assignment because there was intelligence that said the Japanese were trying to recruit black factory workers who were segregated in Detroit to sabotage the war industry there. And so they sent him to Detroit for a while to try to find anything. He never found anything about that, so he went back to Australia. Went to Officer Candidate School at Camp Columbia, Brisbane, graduated at the top of his 700-member class, which there were 13 blacks in and the rest were white. And that story was printed nationally in the black media and all the black newspapers nationwide. And that allowed him, but when he graduated OCS, they tried to assign him to a segregated transportation unit. All the blacks that were in there had come from segregated transportation units except for him. And so he screamed bloody murder and requested transfer over and over and over again. And finally, they transferred him out and transferred him into the 6th Army, and that broke the color line in command in World War II. And that's a story we can document now because we have his orders. Well, anyway, he fought with the 6th Army in New Guinea, which is a bloody campaign, which also ended in a stalemate. We never beat the Japanese on New Guinea. They surrendered when the war ended. And then in Central Philippines, and somebody was talking about Saving Private Ryan. Well, the water invasion, has everybody seen that movie? Okay, the movie starts with a water invasion in Normandy on D-Day. Well, he was in two, not that big, but he was in two on Leyte in October of 44 and Luzon in 1945. There's a movie that's made about the Luzon campaign where they rescue the prison camp. I can't remember what the name of that movie is, but there's a modern movie that's made about that. And matter of fact, there's a banker down in Des Moines that I met whose father, and he's from Luzon, so he's Luzonese, they're called, and his father was killed by the Japanese like a week before the Americans invaded. Might have been able to save him, but so anyway, so he fought, and like I said before, they were set to be the first armed landing on mainland Japan. And so, like I said, my dad's lucky that didn't happen, and I'm lucky it didn't happen because I probably wouldn't have been there if it would have happened. So, that all came about. Well, then the book moves up into the Korean War. Korea, if you talk to most military experts, especially the guys who were there, said that was probably the most difficult war ever for the American military because they weren't prepared for that type of war. They weren't prepared for a war where because of the mountains you had no communication. And I've got the story of it because they didn't have satellite to bounce it off of back then. You had to have line of sight to get a radio transmission. And so I've got a story in there by a guy named George Johnson who was a medic in Korea, and he talks about the horrible things that happened over there, and how they would get the everybody's seen the show MASH, I'm sure, and the movie. Well, a MASH was an actual field army hospital, but before you got to the MASH, you got treated by the medic first, then you got to an aid station. And he said basically you had a 50-50 chance from there of getting a helicopter ride or a truck ride to a MASH unit to get an operation, because they were just trying to stabilize you out in the field. He said that they would have South Korean soldiers carrying the wounded down the mountains, and a lot of times they'd get scared and run, and the Americans just be rolling down the mountains. It's just the craziest sight. But the Chinese who entered the war and the North Koreans, they really wanted to surrender. A lot of them because they were cold and starving, and so there's a story in there about how he precipitates a surrender. So we move from there into the Vietnam period. Okay, Vietnam, we've got several stories in there, personal accounts of Vietnam, one of them being a Marine named Clarence Burno, who's still alive. Matter of fact, he's director of Atlanta's public school transportation right now. But he was in A Shaw Valley. Anybody seen the movie Hamburger Hill? Yeah. Well, Hamburger Hill actually happened in May of 1969, but the first part of the movie, when they're first in combat right at the beginning of the movie, okay, that's in March of 69, and his Marine unit was cutting across the A Shaw Valley to support the Army's 101st Airborne, which was getting shot up. And that's when they got ambushed, and he was hit numerous times, blew off his left arm and his right leg. And fortunately for him, when the radio man was walking in front of him, he got hit like 18 times and just went mangled, but he fell back and Burno fell forward. The Vietnamese were afraid, that somebody got off a radio call and they were going to have a gunship come in, so they all got out of there, but they left 2 guys to check him over and rob him. And fortunately for him, he was hit in his arms and legs, but he wasn't hit bad in the torso. So when they flipped him over, he shot them both with his .45, and that was the last 2 people he killed in Vietnam. Went back to all these operations and blood transfusions, and went to the Great Lakes Naval Hospital and was interviewed there by Walter Cronkite. Well, the thing that people don't know about Vietnam, and we're in the Tet, the Lunar New Year right now, as the celebrations are going on. Well, North Vietnamese launched their greatest attack against America during the Tet Offensive, or during the Lunar New Year. And the reason it was called the Tet Offensive, okay, the reason they launched the attack during the celebration was that they figured that the fireworks were real popular. And the noise of the fireworks, people celebrating, would disguise the noise of their small arms fire attacking all these American targets in South Vietnam. So what they did was that they had, over the year before that, they were smuggling weapons into these areas and bearing this ordinance. And on that particular date, all their guys that they had that were their subversives that were in the population were supposed to go and get these weapons and attack the nearest American facility. That's why, the air bases got attacked, the supply depots got attacked, and everything. Well, that was their biggest gamble, and they thought it would work. And it sounds like a pretty good plan, but the thing about it is Americans had kind of caught wind of it and were really waiting on them. Okay, we had 58,000 men and women killed in Vietnam, and there were 58,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops killed in the Tet Offensive in a week. Okay, and the thing about it is that and it wiped out the Viet Cong. There was no more Viet Cong after that. Viet Cong was a political party. It's just kind of like the Nazi Party in Germany. There's the political party, and then there's the broader army, which is the mass, okay? And in Vietnam, the same way. The North Vietnamese were the broader army. Viet Cong were the political party. They wiped the Viet Cong out. They were no more a factor anymore in Vietnam. Well, as weird as this sounds, the North Vietnamese generals later admitted, that was such a stunning defeat for them. Had the United States counterattacked them right then, they could have walked to Hanoi because they had no more troops to throw against us because they lost so many guys. And you figure if there's 58,000 confirmed killed, that means there's over 100,000 that were killed because you got drag-offs that are usually double the amount of death, and then you got the wounded on top of that. So General Westmoreland, who was our commander in Vietnam at the time, he requested 250,000 troops from the president to counterattack because he had intelligence that that's just what they needed to do. Well, President Johnson, because of political pressure and the anti-war movement, he refused them the troops. The press took that and turned it around because there were some sappers that had got onto the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. A sapper is a guy that rigs a bomb, kind of like they call insurgents now. They're really the roadside bombs. Those are like sappers. But anyway, that's when Walter Cronkite went on the air and said, "I now believe that the Vietnam War is unwinnable," because Westmoreland requested these troops. He thought he requested them because they were losing the war, but he requested them to counterattack because he thought that was a period in which the Vietnam generals later admitted that was when we should have done it. That would have changed everything. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that they took the greatest single victory of the Americans in the war and turned it into a defeat in the media. So it was really, really weird. So anyway, Vietnam was our first really integrated war. There were a lot of racial hostility among our troops over there as well. One of the stories in there is from a guy who was in a C-47, the gunship, called the Spooky gunship, which had a Vulcan minigun. Anybody ever seen the Green Beret movie with John Wayne? You guys are all too young for this stuff. You've seen it, haven't you? You never seen the Green Beret movie with John Wayne? That was the only pro-Army movie ever made during the Vietnam War, and he had to pay for it himself because the studios wouldn't touch it. But anyway, there's a scene in there where they come over this camp. But anyhow, a Vulcan minigun is it's a computerized machine gun. In 3 seconds can shoot enough 7.62 rounds to cover a football field with a hit every 2 inches in 3 seconds. It shoots that fast. It's computerized, and they'd have this mounted, and they would bank the plane and fire down. The fire would be directed from the ground. But anyway, he's talking about that they were, after Martin Luther King's funeral, that they were sitting around, a bunch of the Air Force guys and a bunch of Army guys, and talking about, Martin Luther King's death. And he said, this big group of Southern white boys came up and said, you guys want to buy some mules from that nigger's funeral? Which led to a big fight, of course, and on and on. But anyway, then the book goes up from Vietnam. It jumps into the modern days. And like I said, my son's in the Air Force, so I've got a personal investment in this. And, that's where it is now. And things aren't going well in Afghanistan. And so I don't know. But I'm one of those parents now that every time I see something happen, it hits me just directly, just as it does. And I think all the other parents that are suffering and have suffered through all the wars with their young people going out to fight and a lot of them never coming back or coming back the same. It's interesting, I was complaining to a lawyer friend of mine in Chicago about my son being gone for this last Christmas. And he shot back, hey, he's got 2 sons. These kids are both college-educated officers. They're both multi-tour guys in Iraq, and they're in the Army in the Rifle Course. And his youngest son right now is in Afghanistan in a remote outpost and says that they're under fire every single day. And he's there for a year, and they're hunkered down in a post. And so they're taking rocket and small arms fire and mortars every day. And then if they go out anywhere, then the snipers are shooting at them and the roadside bombs are after them. So, then it's kind of like that we're there. We don't have a mission to win. We're just kind of like there, And so I've got a problem with that. But anyway, the book comes through and goes through all that. Like I said, the illustrations are wonderful, a lot of original illustrations and a lot of very interesting stories. And I think that, if you read it, I think you really feel good about it. So do I have any questions from anybody? Yes.
I remember living through, not as a participant, but about that time I decided that, just to digress, that if I had a son, I wouldn't send him to Vietnam. But my recollection of the Tet Offensive was that was a big loss for the United States.
It's just the opposite.
But wasn't that the general?
Yeah, that's the way the media turned it, because the media was anti-war. And I'm not saying that was a good war. It wasn't. But what I'm saying was the facts of what actually happened and what was reported were two totally different things.
I'm just blown away by that.
Yeah.
Where was your mother at? Was she in Chicago when she did the letter, or was she involved with the atomic bomb?
Yeah, that was at the School of Metallurgy at the University of Chicago. She was up there for the summer visiting her brother, but she was, enrolled at Iowa then, but she went up there for the summer, and that's when she worked on the atomic bomb. And they put her in a room by herself to type the final modifications. Yeah, and she said when they finally told them, they didn't know what they were working on. And when they finally told them, he said everybody just broke down and cried because they knew what a horrible weapon it was going to be and the death that it was going to cause. But they also knew that it might be used to end the war, which it was. So it was a bad. But I heard a guy on a black guy on one of the national news talking about how it was a terrorist act and everything. It's a dummy. He doesn't even know what happened. He's assuming.
Well, the other thing is of it too is that Japan also was concerned about Russia coming in
Right.
at the end of the war at that point too, and that may have also contributed to their surrender.
Well, yeah, and Russia did come in and really, jumped on them. But as a matter of fact, Ho Chi Minh fought for us against the Germans and was prepared to fight for us against the Russians. Because, our commanders wanted to attack Russia at the end of World War II, while they had the troops and the equipment over there to do it, And check this out, you guys. Germans, you talk about death, the Germans killed 15 million Russians in World War II. 15 million. Can you imagine that? And they were still coming. But it's just history. I'm just a historian. I love history. I try to, every time I talk to young people, I say, learn your history, because there's just a lot of contradictions. The things that were really one way and were taught another way. Yeah. And and what other question did you have?
Well, I was about there were probably some other questions in there. I actually forgot. I'm just sitting here thinking about the Tet Offensive.
Yeah.
Because that really was 1969, you say, is the Tet?
No, that was 68, February of 68. Now, you ever seen the movie, anybody, Full Metal Jacket? Okay, the scene where they're in the barracks and the alarm goes off and they all run to their security points and the guy comes busting through in the truck and they all shoot him and everything? Well, that's the Tet Offensive. That's what that was. Those were guys in the rear areas and in the security units on those bases. And when that celebration started, first they heard the fireworks and then the attack started. Yeah, and actually it was a pretty good idea if they wouldn't have gotten found out. It's just like at Leyte, that's another one where my father's Sixth Army was, and we've got his knapsack down at our collection State Historical Society. It's got 3 bullet holes through it where a Japanese Zero strafed him. But they had a heck of a plan, but it just didn't work out for them. They thought they could turn the war by annihilating MacArthur's elite landing force. They were going to wipe them out. General Suzuki, a member of the motorcycle family, because, all those industries are owned by wealthy Japanese. You couldn't be a Japanese officer unless you were from a wealthy family, to begin with. So anyway, they call it, am I running too much over my time over here? They call it annihilation at the beachhead, okay? And what they were going to do is they're going to let the Sixth Army land, which they did, and with little to no resistance. And then on the second day, they're going to attack them from the front. And what they did is they had a naval task force that was hooking around through the strait that was going to be behind them. So they're going to have them in a sandwich, and then they're going to bomb them on top of that. And the second day, they got the largest Japanese anti-personnel bombing of the war, and they're going to wipe them out. Only thing that messed them up is that a little lone Navy scout plane saw that task force hooking up behind them and called in fighters off the carrier fleet, which came in and just tore them up and made them turn back. That's the only thing that saved them. Ain't that something?
One more question.
Uh-huh.
Your dad, was he the very first
To our knowledge, I can
African
yeah,
American and white
yeah.
in an integrated?
And he was segregated in his eating and his living, you know, and so he wasn't passing, you know, and there's a picture of him in the book of him in an integrated officer briefing, and they got Nisi soldiers, which are Japanese Americans there, and they had the Filipino commanders there. Yeah, and that picture's unheard of. That just didn't happen back then.
So your dad, did he discuss this with you like personally?
You know, the first...
Maybe he did talk to him about it.
No, the first inkling that I ever knew about, I didn't know, you know, all his uniforms and stuff were hanging in the basement. And we're dumb kids. We took all the stuff off his uniforms, went and play in the Army, you know, because back in the 60s during the Vietnam War, you know, we were playing Army, man, because you had all that Army stuff coming back. But anyway, you know, you could buy a World War II Jeep in a box for $45 and put it together yourself. But the first thing that made me realize there was something there was when we went to the old drive-in theater on East 14th Street and saw Tora, Tora, Tora. And he got really upset, you know, and we were like, what's up with that? And that's what it was. But see, we were able to find his Army records. He had a big file with copies of every order, everything that he had, and it's down in the bottom of my mother's social safety deposit box. And when I found that, I was able to really do a chronology, and we're able to see the orders of how he got from here to here to here to here to here. It's fascinating stuff. All his officer evaluations, everything.
Not much personal discussion.
Not with him. Yeah. See, you know, but what you find is, and you're finding it even now, because I belong to the AUSA here, which was the Association of the United States Army, and we meet every month out at the Joint Forces Center at Camp Dodge, and they have guys coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they'll tell you, you know, a lot of them have slideshows and stuff, and they'll tell you just what's going on over there. And one of the things that you find is that the guys who are really in the heavy combat don't feel good about it and don't like to talk about it. A lot of survivor's guilt and just a lot of pain, you know, a lot of pain. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to feel real good about killing somebody, you know, even if you were saving your life to do it, you know. So, any other questions? Yes. Well, it's kind of a series of stuff because I started on the TV documentary, which will be on tomorrow night. I hope all y'all will tune it in at 9. Start on that in 1990, and I wrote that, and I went and was able to get Iowa Public Television, Dan Miller, who's the head of that, behind it. And then that kind of mushroomed into the book in 99. Oh, let me take that back. That mushroomed into the project, the Fort Des Moines Memorial Park, which is a 4.6 acre park, and I raised $10 million for that. I mean, I didn't raise it by myself, but a lot of people rode on the bus, but I was the one that drove the bus, okay? And then the Tuskegee project, that was about $100,000. And then that led to the book, my first book, Tradition and Valor. Got some of those over there if anybody wants one. And then to this book. This book took about 2 years, really, because there's so much information in there, and digging up all those personal accounts. And so it you know, it's a labor of love. But this is my biggest ever. This is a big, giant international publisher. This is published by Zenith Press out of Minneapolis, but they're a subsidiary of Quarto Group out of London, which is a giant international publisher. That's why I'm hoping to go to Australia and New Zealand this summer, and because I really want to see some of the areas where my father fought, and they've got publishing units in those places. So there's not, and plus I want to go to London where my son is stationed and see him too. So, you know, Okay. Yeah, another question? Somebody over here had one. Go ahead.
Couple. The first one was, you've mentioned that your grandfather, your father, and your son have served in the armed forces. Have you yourself served?
No.
Or, no?
Nope. When I came out of high school in '76, the draft had just ended, and we weren't even thinking about going in the Army. We went to college, you know. And it was funny that you mentioned that. You know, back in those days, the drinking age was 18. And, you know, the argument was, how can you ask somebody to go to Southeast Asia and blow somebody's head off and they can't even go have a beer down the street at the tavern? But when my son was here, we went to rent a car, and he couldn't rent a car because he was too young. And so I said to myself, now here they are sending him off to war, and he can't even not only have a beer, he can't even rent a car. It's just insane, you know? I mean, it is. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But anyway, so yeah, I went to Iowa. I went to Grandview first, and then went to Iowa and finished there. So, but those were a lot of different times, you know, a lot of different times. And people don't realize how passionate people were, the anti-war movement. Matter of fact, watch my documentary, and you look at the protests that went on in Iowa City. You know, I mean, there's a shot in there of just thousands of students that are in the main square of Pentecrest, and you know, protesting Vietnam War, and it's I mean, you can't even imagine something like that. There's nothing that could happen today that would get people out like that, other than maybe another draft, which is possible. You know, especially if things fall apart in the Middle East, like what's going on now. Okay, I'm done. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, remember, you're going to stay after and full-time work for the
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you.